Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor Greg Dooley and the Pundit Steve Clarke. Men, take the mic.
That's right, it's the Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clarke, and as always, we are proudly presented by Nick Hopwood, who's a certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with confidence. Greg, we are gearing up for the Rose Bowl.
We are indeed, Steve. So, are you booked? Are you ready? Are you all set for your trip? I have to know.
I am just waiting for the most important part, the credential.
Okay.
To be able to get me to the Rose Bowl, but whether I get one or not, I'm going.
So you're locked in. See, I got my credential approval, so I don't know how they do it.
That is scary.
Well, I don't know how they do it and what the order is, but I got to say, I've been lucky enough to get approved for lots of bowl games and playoff games and even national championships, which we didn't play in, right? This one had a special. Getting that email from the Rose Bowl was a little special. And, of course, I've been kind of, when I started covering Michigan and being a member in the press box and the media and all that, always kind of hoped one of those trips would be to the Rose Bowl, and here it is. So
I've been waiting a long time. This is the first year it's been feasible for me to go, and it's been a long wait, and so excited to be able to be in California in that setting for the most anticipated bowl game of the season. Michigan, one of 4 teams that feel like they still have a football season to continue with.
We were talking about this on the way in. Like, how big is the drop-off or not? I know we're sitting here in this rarefied air of with 3 other teams that are in it. How big is that drop-off now? Like, the only thing I can compare it to, is it as big as you're in the NCAA tournament or in the NIT? Is it that big a drop now? I don't know if it's that big a drop because there's still some cachet in some of the bigger bowl games that aren't a part of the playoff, a little bit at least. But with all of the players likely opting out, it does seem like such a drop-off now.
And that's the problem. If you have a full attendance by your playmakers going into the game on both sides, then you feel like there's something worth watching here. But a lot of times now, people are just saying, look, I'm going to protect myself and my NFL draft status. And you were shunned when that first started happening.
Yeah.
I think there's now an acceptance that goes on that says, no, we shouldn't be shunning the players over this. But what it does do, though, if your playmakers aren't playing in the game, then there's not much interest because whoever wins or loses really doesn't say a whole lot about where you are as a program. So Florida State and Georgia should be a wonderful matchup. But you already know Jordan Travis is going to play. How many Georgia players are not going to play in this game? And if the best players aren't going to be there, there's not much interest for me, at least, to find out who wins and what it all means.
Remember, too, it's not just guys who might be going to the NFL and want to get ready for the NFL. It's also people who eventually entered the transfer portal, right? So
exactly.
You've got the double whammy. And so then you wonder, like, who's traveling to go to these games? There's diehard fans who go to see every game. And then there's some people in the area. And then there's, this might be a fun trip, but not a lot. Fortunately, though, Steve, we are not in that situation, but it's exciting, and we haven't had a ton of news like off the field with Michigan football because I think the team was effectively given a full week's break, so there weren't like a bunch of news conferences and stuff, but we started to hear some more on the Harbaugh contract talk. What did you hear?
Yeah, well, John Bacon tweeted out very early that it's nearly there, it's gone forward, numbers are in principle, it all comes down to one thing, the buyout or early termination. Everybody wants to be protected. Jim Harbaugh wants to be protected. The University of Michigan wants to be protected. And that's probably somewhat of a sticking point. And the idea is the University of Michigan says, we've written out something that we're happy with. Jim, would you like to sign it now? Would you like to sign it later? Whatever, it's there. And I think maybe many people are probably reading into the fact that Michigan is saying they're ready to play ball. So now it's all Jim's fault if it doesn't work out. I think there's a little too much being read into that. But I have a feeling that this will not be signed until after the playoff run is over.
And you can understand why Michigan would want a pretty big buyout, given that he's had this dance with the NFL the last 2 years. And if he leaves, they'd like to get something out of it. There'd like to be a little meat on the bone if he makes that decision. And you can understand Harbaugh for maybe not wanting a big buyout to give him the flexibility to go for an NFL team to pick him up. The one thing that I can't really believe is I've heard everything from no NFL team will touch Jim Harbaugh to the constant drumbeat of all of the teams that would have interest in Jim Harbaugh.
It is amazing the number of people that are willing to go out on that limb and say 100% he's not coming back to Michigan. I just don't believe that nothing is even close to being like that. I do know that the longer it gets dragged out, as it has been the last couple of years, the more this kind of hurts decision-making going into the future. And now we're adding people in the NIL portal as well. People want to make some decisions right away about where they're playing. This is a big week of almost free agency being opened up. And Michigan will be last to the table to find out anything because of two reasons. One, we don't know what J.J. McCarthy's going to do. And number two, Michigan should have its head coach, but you're not necessarily sure. And then, of course, the coordinators, both offensively and defensively, could get their job offers. Could be a head coaching job for Sharon Moore. It could be an NFL job for Jesse Minter. They could stay right here. Meanwhile, they continue to recruit, and there is the December signing class that is rapidly coming up, and I don't think any of these things are going to be resolved before that first big recruiting day.
I think the hope is if Jim leaves that the administration would stay intact with like a Sharon Moore and much of the staff, right? So there's just kind of a continuation. Ben Herbert's in place. He's signed. So that's what you'd hope. But that also could be in play here. Like, just as you pointed out, as long as this drags out, some people may have to make some decisions. Now, the one thing we have going for us is no one's leaving until we at least play this game in the Rose Bowl, which is a nice thing. So we have that. Hopefully. You could see people sign, though, right? You could see, I heard that, Indiana was very interested in Mike Hart.
Indiana going with James Madison's Kurt Signetti.
But other good things are happening off the field. Did you see Blake Corum's event at Somerset Mall?
I saw the Michigan Insider video and went through it. 4,000 to 5,000 people waiting at the mall to be involved in all of this. Video cameras with the WTK countdown to kickoff set. I feel like half the starters for Michigan were in attendance on this. And some of your students were there as well. And so they were on the stage with Sam, and there was just a lot of people. So I think that was an absolute fantastic turnout by the people of Southeast Michigan to donate, meet and greet some of the players, and help Michigan's NIL collectives as well.
Yeah, so they did a couple things. They raised, I heard, nearly $500,000 for NIL. Okay. I heard that from one source. They also donate, part of it was a toy drive where they could bring a toy or donate a toy or donate to people in need who need toys and gifts. And they just did a fantastic job. Then they had an autograph signing, which I believe was tied to the NIL after the TKA event. Mm-hmm. By the way, and props to Sam and Ira, because those interviews, if you haven't seen it, the recording is available. Check the Michigan Insider on Twitter. I'm sure it's available on YouTube. Check out the interviews with the players. They were really good, man. The only thing that would have made it better, Steve, is it almost felt like a countdown to kickoff.
It was. But, it is a completely different format, and that's perfectly okay with me.
Yeah, well, he has that relationship with the players, yes. And that's the beauty of Sam. Yes. Like, he got down and dirty and even was needling like Samaj Morgan a little bit for some of the things he said after the Ohio State game, but then how he played and how he rebounded when he got the microphone in the Big Ten Championship. So it was really sweet. So not only emblematic of what happens when you win, right? Would have thousands of people showing up with toys and, willing to support Champion Circle and NIL. Had Michigan, say, lost 3 games this year? Probably not, right? Just people want to be a part of the program. People want to extend this season and this feeling. And I think that's why, Steve, you saw so many people out there. So, but also the power of what NIL can do as far as helping people and putting a guy like Blake Corum and his teammates, frankly, on a great stage and got some great headlines. Other than that, though, it's been weirdly quiet. And I know part of it was because the players were off and we dialed it down. But even during our bye week, Steve, if you remember, it wasn't that long ago, we were right in the middle of all of the sign stealing stuff. It's kind of nice just to be able to relax a little bit, make our Rose Bowl plans, watch charitable endeavors, and ponder contract status. It's kind of weird, actually. I found myself on Saturday anxiously waiting the Army-Navy game just so I could get back in that college football field again. I don't know about you.
Well, I know for me is I'm still looking every hour, waiting for some other news to drop and making sure that I'm not late on it.
Okay.
And it
so you're a little
hasn't been.
are you fidgety then? Are you like refreshing? And like,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm checking every hour on all the various sites that I go to see if somebody's breaking something somewhere, because most of us have been caught off guard with every piece of news item that was happening from the middle of October to the end of the regular season with Ohio State. You know that old cliche, winning cures everything? Mm-hmm. That has.
It's also history is written by the victors.
Yes.
Very similar.
And Michigan continues to win without it, and some of the stuff is fading away. Now, when they need topics to talk about in the offseason, I'm sure it will be there all over again to be readdressed, and more speculation and more guesses about what may happen, to which there is a wide variety of things. The basic deal at Ohio State is they feel absolutely cheated over the last 3 years. And
how do you put the last one in there? But anyway.
Because it fits their narrative to
Okay.
do the last three, because the damage has been done, and, it can't be undone, and therefore, until they win again, it will still feel like they have been cheated. But they think that whatever happened was serious enough that it's going to mean a vacate of wins and things like that. And Michigan people just don't see it as that serious. Many Michigan fans, like thinking best case scenario, see this as level 2, level 3 violation stuff. It's really not that big of a deal. And over time, that's how it will go. And time served with the suspensions and nothing furthermore will come through it. Ohio State fans are just waiting for the big ball to drop and the hammer to fall. And Michigan has to give up 40 some wins or so over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is the Partridge stuff. It's too close to Harbaugh, and I think it will probably be some type of additional suspension for Harbaugh once they get to it, but we don't even know when that's going to be. If you look at history, it could be many months, and Michigan might be able to, will argue it, I'm sure, and try to defend itself. It could push into the next season. We'll see.
And then last Saturday, we were expecting the Jim Harbaugh, Tony Batiti steel cage match.
Right.
Out on the northern end zone, and none of that happened. In fact, people were trying to put videos out there to make it look like something had happened. And if you see full-length videos of right angles, you see it was like kind of tame and timid. So
Yeah.
I think that narrative can be put to bed. Although a great theater, it certainly would be. So Michigan is taking the week off. They'll start preparing for Alabama this week when the podcast hits, taking a cursory look at the Crimson Tide. Right now, the point spread is 1.5 for Michigan, although they claim a lot of the money line bets are going on Alabama, and yet the spread hasn't actually been moved. Your thoughts of what you've learned a little bit about Alabama in the early going?
I think about Nick Saban, right? As soon as I get past the picture of Paul Feinbaum in my head, who's going to be pounding this drum as we head up toward the game, I think of Saban, and that's kind of where I start with Alabama, and I think you have to. I mean, clearly he's built a dynasty at Alabama, but the narrative on him and on his team was that a lot of people, maybe from Michigan and other places who don't like Alabama, which is a lot of people, it's like, well, he's always had a stacked deck because everyone in Tuscaloosa has been on board. He's a perfect example of how the South rolls with paying players, and he only wins when he can stack the deck. That's why he didn't have as much success, say, at Michigan State. That's why he failed in the NFL, because it's a level playing field. Well, you go to Alabama, where there's bag men and all this other stuff, then he's doing great. Oh, now NIL comes. And as Sam Webb says, kind of balance the playing field. Now he's not doing quite as well, and Pee Wee is calling his talk show, right? And he's lamenting to Pee Wee about their struggles, but he turned it around. And so, boom, here he is back. That's where my brain goes. Yeah, Alabama still strikes fear in me a little bit, Steve. I've lived it. I was at that game in Dallas. What was that, 2012? Were you down there in Arlington at that game?
Yes.
Where I think we were in the game for about 30 seconds. We had a good play, and then it was over. And they just overwhelmed, but we've seen them do that to Big Ten teams, right?
Right.
I do have a fond memory, though, of being in person at an Alabama game, and that, of course, was Tom Brady's last game right after the new year of the millennium, 1999, the Y2K year, of course. We beat them down in the Orange Bowl. One of Brady's finest performance, probably one of the reasons he got drafted where he did. I know it was in the 6th round, but he was fantastic. Alabama misses the extra point in overtime, and Michigan wins the game. Great memory for me, but that's where my head goes, is history, is Saban. And I got to say, I am a little surprised about the point spread that we were favored and still are favored as the recording of this. I'm not saying that we would have been huge underdogs. I wouldn't have been surprised, though, and I won't be surprised if the line moves a titch in Alabama's favor, because I think Michigan has more question marks with some of the players and positions, especially with like Zach Zinner being out.
The Tide, though, haven't been enormously impressive, but I'll break down a little bit about their season. We all know that the Tide lost at home to Texas early on and has kind of been of a different team since. The Tommy Rees, Jalen Milroe, the quarterback for Alabama, kind of at odds about how to progress. Jalen Milroe was benched in the next game against Southern Florida. Alabama struggled for a half in that one, won in a low-scoring matchup. And then Jalen Milroe started doing his things, and I think Tommy Rees acquiesced a little bit about how to play this guy and basically treated Jalen Milroe a little bit different than how Tommy Rees was treated by Brian Kelly when he was at Notre Dame. Tommy Rees, the offensive coordinator, played for Brian Kelly at Notre Dame, and he was treated a little bit differently than what quarterbacks are treated in today's standards. But besides the loss there, they played 3 ranked teams, all 3 of them in the teens, and they won each of those games against Ole Miss, Tennessee, and LSU by exactly 14 points. And then in their final game, the SEC Championship in Atlanta, they beat number 1 Georgia. Now, they had 3 wins that were by 6 points or less, and that was at Texas A&M, Arkansas, and the Miracle at Auburn, 4th and goal from the 31-yard line. A second loss definitely would have knocked Alabama out of the championship like it generally does. You have to beat Alabama twice for them not to make the playoffs. Anytime they're undefeated or have one loss, they're always going to be in.
That's actually in the CFP rules.
I think it seems that way.
Yeah.
It seems that way. And, when you look at the team itself, their strongest position group, besides a quarterback, is that this defense has kind of carried Alabama while that offensive grew, and the secondary is the strength. Cooley, McKinstry, Terry, and Arnold are fantastic cornerbacks, might be the best secondary in the nation. And then they're aided by a pair of dual edge rushers. Dallas Turner, who has 8 sacks and is 11th on Mel's big board on ESPN.com, is like the 11th most talented player possibly go through the draft. And then, as I mentioned, the offense is led by their quarterback, who has 23 touchdown passes and 6 picks, carries the ball 10 times per game, has 486 rushing yards this season. At offensive line, J.C. Latham at right tackle is a potential first-rounder. Receiver, the one that sticks out is Jeremy Burton, nearly 800 yards, receiving 8 touchdowns while averaging 22 yards per catch. So he's a big play type of receiver to average that many yards per catch. And the running backs are split between Jason McClellan and Roydell Williams, who combined for 11 rushing touchdowns, which happens to be 1 less than Milroe has rushing. So Milroe, 23 touchdown passes and 12 rushing. He is the guy on offense. The Michigan defense must contain Milroe, and the Michigan offense must rush the ball with success and to do something in the passing game just to keep Alabama's defense honest.
Does their defense compare to any team's defense in the Big Ten to you?
No. I think Penn State's got the total package. At Alabama, their strengths are on the edges, but their weaknesses are in the middle, including vertically at linebacking group is probably their weakest, and horizontally also in the middle in the tackle position, the middle linebacker position. So great on the edges, not so sure in the interior and in the middle of the field, and I think that's what Michigan's going to have to do to exploit it. And these are good pieces of news because Michigan can't do those things with their short passing game, with their tight ends, and being able to run the ball. But you said at the very beginning, Michigan's best offensive lineman, Zach Zinner, will not be playing in this one.
It worries me a little bit what you say about the edge guys because we saw some of that in the last couple of weeks of JJ getting pretty harassed. But if our strategy is to do those short hits and we can exploit their linebackers, especially with our tight ends, there's some opportunity there.
It is, but you have to do enough in the passing game off their edges so that Michigan doesn't become one-dimensional. Otherwise, it's going to look like Michigan-Georgia all over again.
Okay.
Against Georgia 2 years ago, we were there together for that one. Michigan and its power run game, and they couldn't get the run game going, and therefore the passing game wasn't going to work either. Michigan must show a two-dimensional offense to have a chance in this one.
We are talking about the SEC. I think we're all a little shell-shocked from these recent matchups with a fully powered SEC team like Georgia, like Alabama and Dallas. I mean, it's concerning. And I know there were a lot of people reading into the team's reaction when they showed Alabama, I think, on the as the fourth playoff team and Michigan's opponent, that selection Sunday. I do think there was a little bit of a surprise because they expected to see Florida State, and there probably was a little concern, which is fair. But if there's a team we've had that to exploit some of the things that Alabama does, based on what I've seen this season, it does seem like this team will be ready and ready to go. But you still have that fear of the SEC a little bit in your heart. You have to.
Well, the good news, two things. Michigan has a pretty good record against the SEC in bowls over a long period of time. What does a long period of time mean in 2023? Probably absolutely nothing. My read on the video reaction in the Michigan hotel room to having it being Alabama, I read it as what most of the nation has done in the past week and just be shocked and dismayed that Florida State didn't make that fourth slot. To me, it wasn't, darn, it's Alabama. Wow. It's got a lot tougher. This is not the attitude of a confident athlete going into a playoff mode. This is more like, darn, I mean, Florida State just got screwed.
Yeah.
And it was like, it's kind of surprising, and it kind of lets people know that you're an injury away from a top player from having your whole season derailed.
One thing I did hear was that, I don't know if we mentioned it, was that Michigan was, if given the choice, considering the Sugar Bowl for the artificial turf under the right conditions. But one of those conditions is not playing an SEC team, right, which will have a close, an easier path or geography to get to the game. Yeah.
Alabama is used to playing in the Louisiana Sugar Dome. They're not used to playing in the Rose Bowl either.
Yeah, well, neither are we, but we'll be there, Steve. We'll be there. It'll actually be my fifth trip to the Rose Bowl, believe it or not. Sweet. I've been to one Michigan State game, 1988, and then 3 Michigan games, including the 1998 game, of course, for the national championship, which was amazing. So I'm looking forward to that.
I will rely on your guidance as being a freshman going to this game.
Bring a jacket. It cools down once the sun dips over the San Gabriel Mountains.
That's what you said.
That's a pro tip for everybody. All right.
Say it again.
There were a few headlines off the field, though, in the NCAA. Steve, do you want to touch on some of those?
So we're talking about the NIL recently, the Charlie Baker proposal?
Charlie Baker. No problem. Yeah. It's funny you missed his name because it does say something. For an NCAA president, he's been so far in the background, which has been so disappointing to a lot of people who thought, okay, a former governor, he gets how to work people, he understands, so he'll be able to read the room, right? And he just disappeared. And he was running around Capitol Hill trying to get stuff done. But he came out with a proposal, and I think it's interesting. And by the way, this is kind of funny. So this news dropped when my NIL students were taking their final exam. And why, you kind of had to be there. But if you knew of all of the things that we talked about and the dynamics and the issues and the essay questions I was asking them about the landscape and what might the NCAA do and where's revenue sharing going to fit in, these are all essay questions I asked my students. They're all typing them as this news broke. And I actually had students run back into the classroom after the class when they got their phones. And they actually, did you see this, Professor Dooley? It was really funny. It was cool. So
this means nothing now, right, Professor?
Well, right. Yeah. So wait.
Can I change my answer?
Yeah, exactly. So what is it basically? And here's the gist, right, is that they came up with this proposal where it's not approved. It's a proposal. It's an idea that it'll allow schools to opt in basically to pay athletes in a trust fund and run their own NIL. In other words, not have to use third parties or be disassociated with deals and all the stuff that you're supposed to not do today. They're going to allow them to do that, but it would effectively make teams opt into this, into a new kind of like a virtual subdivision. It won't break up the conferences or do anything like that. It's not creating a super conference, but it's basically making you opt in. But they built in certain things where you just can't pay the football player. If you have an athletic department, you have to fund half the athletes, including the women. So there were some rules. A couple weird things about it. The conference commissioners weren't consulted. So that's what I heard. Like Greg Stanky.
Right.
Is it Greg Stanky? The
Sankey.
Sankey. Yeah.
That's Stanky.
That would be great.
I think I have an idea for a T-shirt now.
Yeah. So Sankey, he's like, hey, man, they didn't even talk to us about this. It's like, hey, Baker, thanks for finally doing something. But next time, why don't you let the people know who have all the power, which, of course, are the conference commissioners right now. Also, people aren't exactly sure how it would be implemented, who would opt in. The conferences, like, would they require all their teams to opt into this? Because if you don't, like if only Michigan and Ohio State opt in, that's not fair to Rutgers and Maryland, right? So there's a lot of questions. I will say this, if you want to know the significance, if you're in Professor Dooley's class and I was telling you, hey, the significance is that the NCAA finally did something a little bit proactive to get ahead of the curve. Well, what do you mean? No. Like all the NCAA's ever done, like any change they've made really in their history has been reactive, either to mainly courts and judgments, right? That's how NIL came to be. That's how they structured things. Or complaints of the big schools going, this isn't right, this isn't structured right. Finally, the NCAA president said, hey, here's an idea. Here's how we might do this. And so it does show okay, something's going to happen here related to revenue sharing. Something's going to happen. And that's the key thing. They're actually putting something out there. Will it be this? Will it be something else? No. But at least they're putting their foot forward to say, here's an idea, how we might do it, which is something we haven't really seen the NCAA do, which is nice. But I mentioned the court, Steve.
Right, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they're trying to be proactive.
It could be, right? But usually there's a direct. Okay, they got us, man. The Supreme Brett Kavanaugh got us, right? The Supreme Court, he got us in the Alston case. They slammed us 9-0. Okay, fine. You've mentioned this, Steve. There's this antitrust lawsuit out there around transfer eligibility, which is basically saying you can't have any restrictions on the transfer. Right. How can you? Right. Citing the antitrust law, right?
The idea that you'd have to sit out a year, they don't like that at all. Things right now, you could basically go to 3 schools. You can enroll in the school as a freshman. You're allowed to make 1 transfer without sitting out. And as soon as you actually get a degree, you can transfer again without having to sit out. So it's fairly simple, but sometimes if it doesn't work out at step A and doesn't work out at step B and you have not gotten your degree yet, now you would have to wait and transfer to another year. There's a lawsuit that will challenge that.
Yep. No, and I understand it. And then they're still facing this multi-billion-dollar potential lawsuit of people who weren't of athletes who weren't able to benefit from NIL. Mm-hmm. And saying, well, we would have benefited from NIL, right? Like Denard Robinson. No, he's not in the lawsuit, but a guy who would have made millions, right? You've got the National Labor Relations Board with unfair labor around USC and the right to unionize and athletes to be employees is still out there. And all other kinds of lawsuits with athletes and former athletes have popped up, which makes me wonder, Steve, how is the NCAA paying for all these lawyers and all these lawsuits?
Where does the NCAA come up with enough money to defend every single thing that is being thrown at them?
And you're right. All the precedent, they kind of have a point that the NCAA has been such a hypocrisy. There's so many holes in it that are being poked open wider and wider and wider that people are jumping in. And yeah, I wonder who's paying for it. And remember, the NCAA, what is it? It's basically a collection and governed by all of the schools that are members, of the member institutions. So you have to wonder, is the NCAA, the central organization, going to come back with an assessment and go, hey, by the way, here's our legal bills, guys. Remember that? I know you thought we had all that NCAA tournament money, which is, again, they're basically their only revenue source. You're not getting it this time because we had to pay our lawyers, remember? That would be something.
So does the NCAA actually need an NIL collective to fund their lawsuits? Please donate now to defend what college football used to be like.
That would be the worst ever.
Collective?
Yeah, it would be the worst. It'd be the worst. What do you get? We have these old T-shirts.
So far, our website shows up to date at $22.76 you can donate it to the NCAA Lawyers Collective Fund.
Right.
We'd like to thank Mark Emmert for his donation.
Oh, my God. That's great. That is great.
It's just going to be different, and it's probably going to be semi-pro, and it's going to be probably ultimate free agency all the time. I always joked about the idea that somebody could probably transfer in season, play for one team in 1 week, and actually play for another team in another week.
Well, that would be the thing right now, right? Transfer to a playoff team and have 3.5 weeks to get ready at your position and learn the plays and be ready for the game.
Just got called up from the minors.
Right. So, Steve, you saw this proposal about this innovative NIL deal.
Oh, yeah.
Break it down for me.
Yeah, no, so it's a former coach, now a radio guy out in Nebraska. Hey, morning show banter, right? Put out a proposal to put a player's Venmo on the Jumbotron when said player makes a big play, and then allows fans to donate in real time. And then the scoreboards would then track, the rolling numbers, like watching somebody's Twitter profile kind of revolve like a slot machine. You see the numbers continue to build up in between the plays. This comes from Bill Bush, again, former Big Ten coach, now a personality in Nebraska. And I could just see that you make one of those futuristic The Running Man movies with Richard Dawson or The Hunger Games, and it's just kind of out of control. This is one of those things that I could see. Somebody gets a sack, player does a sack dance, and then all of a sudden the guy's Venmo number comes up and everybody's like, love that play, love that guy.
Yeah.
And you just watch the numbers roll in. Meanwhile, the player is out on the field and he just starts looking at the Jumbotron to see those numbers roll up, and he completely misses the play, and the guy's running through him for a touchdown, and that guy's going to get a whole bunch of numbers.
Right, or he didn't get enough and he's going to sit out the next play. I'm not going in there.
Yeah, I'm not going in too. The player whips out his own phone and shows it to the 100,000 people, at Penn State. It's like, you guys didn't give enough. I'm not going out there again until you raise me some more money.
Yeah. Now, clearly, Mr. Bush, the radio guy, this is a violation of the NCAA's pay-for-play policy. It's like literally paying them for a play. Like this is the clearest violation of what the NCAA guidelines are. It's actually pretty easy. And of course, on the scoreboard of the university, like they're tied to it now. Like, no, you cannot do that.
At least right now you can.
There are like gray areas, but could a third party buy an ad and sell Blake Corum's t-shirt? When he does a great play or things like that. There are probably ways around it, but I think it's pretty funny. Steve, dare we talk a little M hoops for a little bit? I don't want to bring everybody down.
Won't be long.
I gotta say, man, I was excited after the St. John's game in New York City where we blew St. John's out. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, who are these guys? They're playing some defense. They're moving the ball around. Doug McDaniel looks like, lottery pick. Oh, I can watch these. This will be enjoyable. We'll have some basketball to watch this year. And basically since then, it feels like it's evaporated.
In your defense, though, Greg, you haven't seen Sunday night's game, Michigan winning in Iowa City, getting back to the 500 mark with a convincing win, 90-80. Wolverines led by as much as 20 in this one after Iowa coach Fran McCaffrey got kicked out of the game. Terrace Reed Jr. shattering his previous career high with 19 points and was actually 5 of 7 from the free throw line. Really good news there. Wolverines hosting Eastern Michigan after a much-needed quad one win. But last year, Greg, this team was 1-4 in overtime, including losing 3 straight down the stretch in Big Ten play that doomed their NCAA fate. I'll be intrigued to see how all the new players respond. There are some good players out there for Michigan basketball, but I have to ask you, did you expect anything different from all of the loss of the players from Hunter Dickinson to Jett Howard and Kobe Buffkin leaving? Did you expect it to be different at all?
No, and that's why I was pleasantly surprised where I thought of something I saw. So I guess the upside is it does look like we have some pieces that are pretty solid that I didn't think were going to be there. Maybe they can pull it together. Jawan, his role and all that with Coach Martelli, we got to give him a little bit of chance, but
I'm willing to give the coaching staff a lot of latitude, but the players have got to start winning close games.
Yeah.
And there was a big turnover in this roster, and what have we seen so far? We had 2 close games that looked like Michigan should have won, and they didn't get it done in the final minute, which was a lot like last year and how it ended their season.
One way or the other, Steve, we'll be talking about Michigan basketball on this podcast.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Should we head to the locker room, Steve? As I saw you kept it in the last edit that we're heading to the locker room. Steve and I are heading to the locker room for halftime. What do we do in the locker room? I don't know. Get some Gatorade.
Gatorade.
All
Yes,
right.
That's it. Let's just be forthright in what's happening in the locker room.
All right,
We're resting
man.
up, getting some Gatorade. Let's talk to Nick Hopwood.
Let's talk to Nick.
Nick, sometimes Greg and I do interviews. Do you interview new prospective clients?
That's probably one of the first things you do with people after you get to know them is, okay, we got to understand, what are your goals, right? I would assume these are conversations you have, which are all variables for you.
Yeah, we want to understand what your goals are and what's important to you. Those are some of the first conversations that we want to have. Okay, I hate talking about budgeting, but I do have a sweet spreadsheet where I track expenses and net worth each month. This is kind of like a minimum thing that everyone should be doing, but nobody does. Because if you're spending $15,000 per month living your life right now, we need to say what expenses will still be there in retirement. And maybe your mortgage will be paid off, and maybe the kids will be out of the house. So you only need $10,000 a month. But here's the problem. People just don't know what that goal is. When I ask people, what are your cost of living? They start adding up their expenses in real time. I want you to do real homework for months and months. You know, a lot of people still don't do it, but it's mission critical, in my opinion.
I'm guessing a lot of people don't want to do that because it's frightening.
Yeah, it's painful. You have to look inward and really deal with your demons, kind of a thing.
And especially today with all the subscriptions that it kind of gets lost because it's Netflix here and Amazon Prime just hit and my Costco subscription just renewed. All this stuff adds up pretty fast and it can be a little frightening, but you got to do it. You got to know. So that's interesting to me.
Thanks, Nick. And if you want to ask some financial questions or if you have concerns or if you just want some tax advantage strategies at the end of the year, why don't you give Nick a call at 734-681-7575 or at peakwm.com, 734-681-7575 or peakwm.com.
All right. Well, thanks, Nick. And by the way, I know some people are like, well, how did I even go about the process of talking to Nick and moving my assets to somebody like Nick? Well, call Nick. He'll explain it. If you're wondering, like, hey, it's difficult because I don't want to sell my assets and take a tax hit. No, there are ways you can transfer money. Nick can explain. There are laws that allow you to move money without a tax implication from one broker or one account to another. But Nick can hook you up with that. Talk to him. We do need to ask Nick. I assume he's coming out to the Rose Bowl, Steve, but we'll have to find out. Maybe we'll have an update next show on Nick's plans.
That would be great.
Cool.
Because we'd like to be able to meet with him and his family. We've done that a couple of times before, so that would be great. And as far as, there's always going to be a few losers in the market.
I just want winners. And speaking of winners.
We all do, but it doesn't necessarily work out that way.
It doesn't, especially for Florida State, Steve. And I haven't got off of Florida State Island here where I would have dug my heels in, and I still feel that way if I were a committee member. And one of the things we were going to kind of talk about last time was, like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to this this formula? Because it is something that I teach in my history college athletics class. And you're really good with, say, the recent manifestations of how we got to a committee, right?
Within my lifetime.
Yeah. So I'll touch on some really key points. But there's some really funny things, like right after, say, the Rutgers-Princeton game, the first game in 1869, football kind of caught on with those Ivy League schools. And at one point they said, we should figure out who's the champion, right? Between playing each other, and that's all they did. Well, the rules weren't anything like they were today. It was basically a nonstop rugby scrum with a clock. But they said, well, what if we tie, Steve? What if Harvard ties Yale? Who's the champion? Well, they'd say, well, whoever the previous champion was keeps the championship, right? That kind of makes sense. If you tie, you retain, right? Kind of like the Ryder Cup. But, Steve, they didn't have downs or anything like that. So you could just sit on the ball and tie the game. And that's what they found people did. So that's how exciting the game was back then. So a guy named Walter Camp, which many of you know his name, said, we got to do something about this. So that's actually why we have downs. He created the system of downs where you have to do something to move the ball forward. So you couldn't just sit on it and end in a 0-0 tie like the shot clock. Remember the four corners offense where some teams would literally hold the ball till the end of the game? Yeah, that's what they used to do, and that's how it started. Beyond that, there have been a couple, like, people didn't care so much outside of the East. They just assumed the East champion was the best. But then when Yost came to Michigan and you had teams like Stagg at Chicago, they started to say, well, I think we're as good as the East teams, right? So it kind of started a debate, are we as good as them? And then it wasn't until really into the 1930s that you had somebody go, we got to figure this out, and we got to have a system to figure out who's national champion. And it was actually an Illinois professor, Steve, believe it or not, who came up with a point system. A guy named Dickinson from Illinois came up with a system to say he scored your wins and losses based on where you played, the quality of the opponent, the result. And he came up with a point system called the Dickinson system. And Michigan has 2 national titles in 1932 and 1933, thanks to the Dickinson system. And then right after that is when the AP kicked in. It was 1936 that the AP started to do a vote during the season. They started in the middle of the season, but started voting on who is the best team in the land, and then did everything up to the regular season, right? They picked a national championship. And then finally, in 1947, they did a postseason vote after the Rose Bowl.
First time.
And that is the time that Michigan and the Mad Magicians won the 1948 Rose Bowl, January 1st, 1948. Michigan dominated that game.
49-0.
Yep. They decided to do another vote, and so Notre Dame won the regular season title in the AP vote. They did an unprecedented postseason vote, and Michigan won that one. And we've never been the same since. So,
Yeah, both claimed it.
Yeah, they both claim it. Oh, they both absolutely claim it. And there's many, many instances of that. The coaches poll was added in 1950. And then, Steve, from here, it's kind of been up until like 1998, there have been multiple schools claiming the national championship,
Yeah,
right? Depending on the vote.
One of those years that kind of really started off the debate, 1966, between Notre Dame and Michigan State.
Yep.
That ended up being in a tie. And Notre Dame was given the national championship. Ara Parseghian played it safe in that game because they knew that maybe a tie would be good enough for them to win a national championship, something else for Michigan State to be very upset about. And I look at 1984, in which all of the top programs, the top national programs, all had losses on their schedule. Nobody was undefeated except one team out west in Provo, Utah, and that was BYU. And BYU didn't really play anybody on their schedule, and they were the only team that was 12-0. And they said, we're going to have to give it to BYU because teams like Miami lost, teams like Washington lost, teams like South Carolina lost. They just couldn't decide who would win it. They're going to give it to the undefeated team. And the one team that they played was a 6-5 Michigan football team in which they won by a single touchdown. But people somewhat begrudgingly accepted that. And then from there on, there were split national championships. And people were having a hankering. Why are we speculating? Why are we voting? How can we make this go on? Don't you realize that the Associated Press writers are writing about their own team and really don't have much of a cursory glance at what all the other teams are doing, and we're ranking them based on that?
Yeah.
The coaches, they have a poll. It's even worse. They have a poll out there, and the coaches aren't keeping track of what the other teams
Even worse
are
than
doing.
the writers not keeping track. I mean,
can
how do you run a football team and like put a legitimate
You
vote
can
in?
see it, for an example, the coaches this year trying to sound educated, like they know what's going on with the Michigan sign sealing saga. The ignorance, it's not their job to pay attention to that. Their job is to pay attention to their own football team and make them the best football team possible. That the coaches kind of have a vote, and you hear the stories that they're not even voting. They're signing their name to what the SID would actually do the polling for them. Eventually, Michigan-Nebraska wasn't the first split championship. It certainly made people clamor for 1998. Can't just have the AP and the coaches. We got to have the computers involved in all this. And so the BCS allowed the computer averages at 33%. And then when they found out that Miami of Ohio was kind of ranked in the top 4 before the process is complete, the fans went and said, we can't have the computers have this much influence in deciding the national champion. And they kept tinkering with it year after year because you know what? There was always going to be a certain amount of fan base that didn't trust it and didn't want it. And eventually they tinkered with the BCS so badly, they just got rid of it. And they came up with a 14 playoff eventually. And Greg, the whole thing about the playoff committee, their job was to tell you who is number 4 and who is number 5, which is exactly where we are today.
Yep.
And I knew it way back then. You're never going to get a college football fan base universe to accept a decision because everybody has their own self-interests involved and differences of opinion, and it's never going to work that way. It's like, darn it, we get an expert committee that would have Condoleezza Rice and retired media members and ADs and coaches and the most brilliant minds to know about the game. We'll put them in a committee, and when they render their decision, everybody will nod their head and say, yep, they got it right. Never, ever going to happen. And this Florida State thing is certainly one of the most difficult years that a committee's ever had to come up with. Somebody was going to get screwed. It was going to be a travesty for some team and their fan base, and it happened to be Florida State.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. It really does come down to the four, who's left out, right? That's that fifth spot.
That's your job.
And it is. And you're right, because I maintain, like we've had very little debate about seeding. Have you noticed that? Which, to your point, very, very little. No. That we should have been. Michigan felt like they should have been number one last year, but there wasn't a ton. I got a couple texts. We should have been number one. But you're in.
Prove it on the field.
Right, and that's what they've acknowledged, like with the 12-team playoff, is that the conference champions should get a golden ticket, and they do. They're going to, for the Power 5 or Power 4, whatever you want to call it. They're going to get through. Florida State would be in.
They'd have a home game.
They'd have a home game. So fans would be going, that's BS. We got a home game. This will be fine.
We got a home game. We're going to make money off it.
This will be fine.
We're going to watch them beat up on a group of 5 team that's going to be ranked number 12.
Most
and
likely.
It's going to give them momentum going into the playoff. There will always be that argument about, hey, they got a game under their belt again while this team has had maybe too much rest.
Yep.
Then they're going to come out stale. And being in the 5 position may not be the worst thing in the world. Only time will tell when we start to see the results, whether number 5 has an advantage or a disadvantage, whether the extra bye week actually does help a team. Yeah. I think it's going to help Michigan in this case because I think they needed the 3 weeks off to get healthy.
Yeah, and I mean in Florida State, like in their case, they'd probably love because they're trying to have that deal with the ACC where they keep more of their revenue that they earn, right? Well, home game, that sounds pretty good. That said, Steve, I'm glad we're not one of those teams wondering where they would be. In fact, we're the number 1 team in the land, and we are the number 1 team in the AP vote right now by a pretty wide margin. It wasn't the only thing people voted on, though. Was this the worst Heisman race ever? Was this the most boring Heisman race to you this year?
No, Michigan certainly wasn't involved in it. I got to think about the teams, that are in the playoff. Texas didn't have a Heisman Trophy candidate. Alabama, no.
Washington, yes. Penix.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would have voted for Penix, but beyond that, very little interest. Bo Nix's story, kind of interesting. Haven't really watched the LSU quarterback Daniels play that much, the guy who won it. I've seen his stats. They're fantastic. There was no excitement for me, and maybe we're spoiled for having like a hutch and the fact that JJ was the favorite at one point during the season and dropped off. I just had no interest in it at all and didn't even bother to watch any of the coverage, despite being a fan of history.
I did watch the new 30 for 30 Heisman race of 1997. It's the 25th anniversary this weekend, by the way, of Charles Woodson winning it.
That was exciting, Steve, by any standard.
So I watched the ESPN 30 for 30. If you're into history and want to relive the moments, it's absolutely fantastic. I found that whoever produced and directed the show were not Michigan or was not Tennessee. There's a lot of attention paid to Peyton Manning. He kind of dominates most of the conversation here, even though he didn't win it. But it was a reminder, again, of how the stories played out. And I necessarily don't want to revisit the argument of Peyton Manning versus Charles Woodson, but I think it simply came down to the fact that Charles Woodson, at the end of the year, in big games, made big plays, while Peyton Manning just continued to throw his 4 touchdowns and 350 yards per game. Tennessee happens to play one big game during the season. It's always the 3rd Saturday in September against the Florida Gators, and Tennessee lost.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, where was his big moment in a big game? Lost to Florida. Now, Florida was the defending national champions in 1996, so you can somewhat think about giving him a pass. But Charles Woodson had 2 defining plays at the end of the season. One was the one-handed interception against Michigan State, and the other was the punt return against Ohio State, where it meant everything.
Yeah.
Basically, Charles Woodson won every region but the South.
Yeah. No, he won fairly easily, and maybe some of it was the novelty. I think a big thing was the Florida game. So who else was there? Randy Moss was also there.
Yep.
Who was the fourth one?
Ryan Leaf.
Ryan Leaf was the fourth one, who, by the way, was a fantastic college quarterback. Yep. You know, he was great in that Rose Bowl.
So it chronicles all of that, and what makes this ESPN 30 for 30 different is they don't do interviews with people looking back. All they do is just show old clips and what people were saying in 1997, including showing WOLV TV on cable, the student-run TV channels. One of the lines was actually kind of quite prophetic. But there was a little bit
of that. Was Ira on there? But didn't
no,
Ira
he was not there. You understand a little bit about Tennessee's anger in all of this. They've always blamed ESPN for Peyton Manning losing. You can kind of look back at this documentary and say ESPN may be the reason why Peyton Manning was given the Heisman Trophy in September, the way ESPN's coverage of the whole thing was. But Tennessee to this day still not has a Heisman winner. And they're probably thinking this is going to be our first. And they felt that way ever since Peyton Manning decided not to go pro and returned for his senior season. They pretty much felt it was theirs in the bag, and it was taken away from them as they were always trying to find each and every week somebody who could contend with Peyton Manning. And it flipped.
Yeah, sure.
The number 2 contender could have been a guy from Penn State, could have been a guy from Auburn, could have been a guy from Iowa. There was just all these different weeks, and finally Woodson kind of ascended. And there was, in my opinion, a look over years past wondering why does it always go to a quarterback or a running back? Why not a defensive player? Why does it have to be a Division I team from a power football program? Why can't it be some guy from Mount Union?
Right.
And I think there has been some sort of media gentle push, or at least asking the question, why can't it be unconventional? And Charles Woodson was playing outstanding defense and sprinkling him in on offense and making plays on special teams that got him the Heisman Trophy.
Yeah.
But boy, do I remember that day. I could listen to the Tennessee AM radio station in Knoxville, garbled in the static late at night at that Heisman Trophy. In the hours afterward that Charles Woodson won, I'm listening to the radio and people going insane on the radio. And that was just the callers. The hosts were even far more insane than the calls that they took in, because they just absolutely felt the entire system was broken.
I love it. I would have called in and acted like a Tennessee fan. And the other thing, it wasn't even close. It wasn't even close.
That's when a radio station hits the 6-second dump button.
Yeah.
And you'd be gone, and it would never.
He lost by a mile. He almost got third. Yeah. I love it. What else? I finally saw the new Indiana Jones movie. I guess it's not new anymore. Have you seen this one?
The latest one?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about like you've never seen Indiana Jones before?
No, of course I have. I grew up on Indiana Jones.
Okay.
And then my heart was broken. My heart wasn't ripped out. No pun intended, Indiana Jones fans. My heart was broken by the stupid one in Central America with the spaceship, the last one.
Crystal Skull. Never saw that one.
It was one of the worst movies I've ever seen. It was so bad that it actually harmed, I think, the rest of the franchise, retroactively hurt the first few movies. I love the first one. I love the third one. And I finally saw this one like an old man. I waited for it to come on TV, Steve.
Yeah.
I didn't watch it. It was great. And I got to say, do you remember when they went back and post-edited Indiana Jones to take all the guns out? Do you remember this? People got really pissed. George Lucas, whoever, went and they cut a version of the movie where they took guns out of people's hands as a statement against gun violence. You don't remember this?
No.
They did it for the first one. And South Park, all these people went crazy. How stupid is this? Come on, guys.
There's still some good in you, Mr. Lucas. We know there is. It is too late for me, boys.
So early in this movie, they have someone grabs a German Luger and just shoots somebody right away, and I'm like, okay. And I half wonder if the audience cheer, the big nerd fans went, finally the guns are back. It was pretty good. I liked it. So anyway, that was fun. But I have time to do this stuff. I'm grading exams. I'm getting ready for the Rose Bowl. Kind of wrapping up the school year and kind of unwinding, man. What about you? What else you got the next couple of weeks?
I, like the Michigan football team, took most of it off and, prepared for my Wednesday morning segment, the Midweek Peak on on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA with Sam and Ira. And yeah, now this is a week where I start looking a little bit more into how Alabama won and how did they lose to Texas. Why was it a near miss against Auburn? Why was it a near miss at Arkansas, Texas A&M? I'll look into all those things and see where Michigan might actually have a solid game plan to actually, pick this win up, because Michigan has not won a bowl game in quite some time. And
it's the one thing people still have like on heart. Like you pointed out last time, there were always like jokes that the punchline was, well, Michigan's wouldn't know. They'd never been in Indianapolis. Like those were the jokes, right? So those are gone. Can't say anything about winning, can't say anything, but the one thing they can say is the final game of the season, we've lost a lot of them. It's like the last little kind of tired take against Harbaugh. So here we go. Yeah, can we get it done?
Yeah, and if you want to feel good about Michigan's chances, just go watch The Journey on the Big Ten Network the last couple of weeks, leading up to the Ohio State game and leading up to the Iowa game. You start feeling really good in the fact that Michigan may be a team of destiny. Michigan may be a different team. We have seen it, in their previous teams since COVID, that they just seem to be a different mindset, different mental mindset, and they're winning close games, and they're coming out on top. But the bowl games are, they ran into a Georgia juggernaut, and they definitely got upset by TCU. This is, I think, a very important game for Michigan coming up against Alabama, and whether Nick Saban, is he fading a little bit?
Right.
We will find out, or is it back and better than ever?
Does Pee Wee have a point? And does the narrative in Saban, which we kind of let off, that he's now, it's not an uneven playing field where NIL has kind of leveled the playing field and we can compete with Alabama for recruits and transfers and stuff. Is it catching up with Nick Saban? We'll find out. We'll talk more. Maybe we'll talk a little Rose Bowl history too. We haven't talked about that because Michigan, of course, plays big in the history of the Rose Bowl.
Yep.
Playing in the first one and how that came to be, what it is and what it isn't. There's some myths around that. Maybe we'll get into that next time.
Before we go, got to mention, you talked about last week about the shrimp cocktail at St. Elmo's. One of our mutual friends and listener of the podcast actually went and bought St. Elmo's wasabi cocktail sauce, brought over some shrimp. So I got to experience that. Big thank for Laura and Jeff for providing that, and it's absolutely outstanding, and it did clear the nasal passages. That's for sure.
I got to get some just for nostalgia, just to go back to that moment, because again, I didn't even know that was kind of part of the thing. I just thought they were going to be these shrimp as big as your head. That's what I thought it was going to be on a tray. No, it's the sauce. So I got to get some too. That's awesome. You tried it, Steve. I bet it tasted a little bit like victory in your nose.
It did. Well, the whole month of December is golden for me because right now, Michigan is the 3-time Big Ten defending football champions. This month is great. Go Blue, Greg.
Go Blue.